All right, today we're tackling a big one, the creation of Canada. But this isn't a story about one big, fiery revolution. Nope, it's a story that unfolds over centuries, built out of conflict, and most importantly, some incredibly tough compromises. We're going to trace the key moments that literally forged a nation out of a huge, contested continent. So let's start with the central question, right? I mean, think about it. How do you actually build a country from a continent? It's one thing if you have a small territory or a single shared culture, but how do you take a piece of land this vast, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, with all its different peoples and landscapes, and turn it into one single nation? Well, the answer isn't some simple, single event. It's this long, messy, 400-year process. And it's a story defined by three really powerful forces: the clash of giant empires, the absolute necessity of compromise between rivals who did not like each other, and, of course, the brutal reality of conflict. And that story really begins with one foundational event, a single military victory that would create the country's deepest, most lasting fault line. We're talking about the legacy of what history simply calls the conquest. You know, what's just wild when you look at this timeline is how fast it all happened. I mean, in just a handful of years, the entire dream of a French empire in North America just dissolves. The tipping point is 1759, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. It was a short, incredibly brutal fight right outside Quebec City, but it decided the fate of a continent. By 1763, it's a done deal. France is gone. So the most crucial thing to understand is what the conquest actually created. See, this wasn't an empty piece of land that Britain just took over. Not at all. It was a functioning society of 70,000 people with their own language, their own Catholic faith, their own legal system. And this one fact, a huge French-speaking Catholic population now living under a British Protestant king, that becomes the central tension that drives almost everything for the next 100 years. Okay, so just as this new, awkward reality is setting in, another massive event to the south just throws a wrench in everything. The American Revolution wasn't just about creating the United States. It also, almost by accident, ended up shaping the kind of country Canada would have to become. Just look at this number for a second. 40,000. After the American Revolution, tens of thousands of people who sided with the British suddenly found themselves on the losing team. They were seen as traitors. So about 40,000 of them packed up and fled north. They were a massive wave of political refugees, and they brought with them this core idea, a deep, passionate loyalty to the British crown and a rejection of the new American Republic. And this is the new problem in a nutshell. You already had the French-Canadian population, and now you've got this huge flood of English-speaking Protestants whose entire identity is wrapped up in being not American. There was just no way these two groups could live under the exact same system. So what did the British do? They basically decided to divide and conquer, or maybe divide and accommodate. The Constitutional Act of 1791 literally split the colony in two. You get Lower Canada, what we now call Quebec, which kept its French civil law and its unique land system. And then you get Upper Canada, now Ontario, which was basically built from scratch for the Loyalists, with English common law and land you could own yourself. It was a political fix that basically drew two completely different societies onto the map. Now, this two-part system kind of worked for a while, but eventually it completely fell apart. And that brings us to our next huge moment, Confederation. But this wasn't some passionate flag-waving revolution. This was a practical, almost reluctant solution that was born out of pure necessity. So the two candidates were later joined together in 1841, but that just created a whole new problem: complete political paralysis. The French and English sides had totally different goals, and since they had equal power, nothing could get done. Imagine a car with two steering wheels and two drivers trying to go in opposite directions. The whole machine of government just ground to a halt. And it wasn't just that things were broken on the inside. You had these huge pressures from the outside, too. The American Civil War was raging just south of the border, and there was a very real fear that the gigantic Union Army might just decide to turn north when it was done. On top of that, Britain was basically saying, hey, you guys need to start paying for your own defense. And to top it all off, a big trade deal with the US was ending, so the colonies had to figure out how to trade with each other to survive. So the solution they came up with was, frankly, kind of brilliant: federalism. This was the genius of the Great Compromise. The idea was, let's create a big, strong national government to handle the important stuff, like defense and trade. But, and this is the key part, let's also create provincial governments that have power over local things like culture and language and laws. It was the only way they could get everyone, especially French Canada, to sign on. So, the Dominion of Canada is born in 1867, but it's really just a country on paper, just a few provinces clustered in the east. The final chapter of its creation is the story of how that little country was stretched all the way across a continent, a story that involves some absolutely insane promises and a truly tragic, bloody price. I mean, just listen to this quote. It perfectly captures the pure audacity of the time. To get British Columbia to join the new country, the Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, made what seemed like a totally impossible promise to build a railway across thousands of miles of wilderness. But this railway wasn't just about moving people and goods. It was meant to be the iron spine that would hold the new nation together. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. This timeline shows a really tragic parallel. As the government and the railway pushed west, they ran into resistance from the Métis and their First Nations allies, who were seeing their entire way of life destroyed. Both rebellions were led by the same man, Louis Riel. And the final contrast here is just devastating. In a single week in November 1885, the country is physically stitched together with the last spike of the railway and then immediately torn apart politically by the execution of Riel. And this really captures the two sides of that nation-building coin, doesn't it? On one side, you have the promise fulfilled, a country connected from coast to coast, a West opened up for settlement and progress. But on the other side, you have the terrible price of that unity, the dispossession of Indigenous peoples, and a deep, bitter wound between French and English Canada over Riel's execution that would fester for generations. So after all that, what kind of country does this all create? Well, one of its main architects, Georges-Étienne Cartier, had a fascinating term for it, a political nationality. The idea is that Canada wasn't founded on a shared ethnicity or ancient ancestry. It was born out of a series of political deals. The identity isn't about shared blood, it's about a shared agreement to live together under a very specific set of compromises. And that really brings us to the present. When you look back, the story of Canada is this repeating cycle. A deep conflict appears that threatens to tear everything apart. And survival always depends on finding a new, difficult compromise. From the conquest to the loyalists to political deadlock, that's been the pattern. So it leaves us with one big question, right? What is the next great conflict that's going to demand the next great Canadian compromise?